I wore my best creases for you today. You're welcome. I am Anita Renee Kulthapi Lara. I come from the land of prickly pear and cholla blossom, the land where the yucca twine winds tightly the prayers of my ancestors. My family has held down the south valleys of the Rio Grande for generations, our existence ancient beyond memory. In my home, my dad continues to remind me that the border crossed us, and that frontera was called homeland before the line was drawn in the sands of the Rio. Sorry. When I found out that I had 2 to 5 minutes to tell you my story, I thought to myself, no, that's not gonna happen. My almost 100-year-old abuelita is proof that long wind runs through my blood. I was built by the Creator to fill the air with memories of what was and what will be at a slow, leisurely pace. I didn't know how I was going to sum up the journey that has placed me here in front of my mentors and cohorts. I asked myself over and over, how do I tell you about my love for fresh, roasted, and peeled green chili with ripe summer tomatoes all wrapped up in a hot, piping homemade tortilla? I didn't know how I was going to help you imagine the spicy flavor that rushes from the tongue to the belly, and the refreshing relief that is felt when the flavors of the tomato follows up like an oasis in the desert. Are you hungry yet? As I began to search the seed kiva of my memory, I decided I would begin where it all started. In the most beautiful milpa in all the land, my great-grandmother Inesti's backyard. That's her. It's her birthday today. She just turned 98. Her backyard milpa was a place of adventure, of plant songs and stories. It was a place where all the worries and expectations of the world melted away. This was my first meeting with the plant and food medicines. I remember her maize growing so tall that it blocked the sun. The sunflowers and melon plants that brought the hummingbirds, the beans and squash that grew up the back fence. And I recall that rather interesting plant, the one with that skunky dank smell, the one that my grandpa would crush up and mix up with vinegar and rub on his joints to relieve the swelling and inflammation of arthritis. But my childhood wasn't always this summer harvest dream. I was born to 2 teenage parents, and we lived humbly in the Pueblo of Tortugas in a small home. And unknown to me for many years, we were money poor. I am no stranger to commodity cheese and bologna sandwiches, spam and potatoes, tortillas with butter. Those are all delicacies in my home. You know that saying, it takes a village to raise a child? Well, for me, that is true. I watched my parents hustle to make ends meet, and meanwhile, I was watched over by all the grandmas and aunties and cousins and neighbors. And when I was old enough to latchkey, I was in charge of my own after-school snack. Behold, my 25-cent after-school special from Loli Fritz's Tiendita. A pickle, a donut, a pack of 7-Up lime salt, and a bubblegum cigarette. What else did a res kid like me need? Those snacks, they were a food group all their own. Free lunch and breakfast was my nutrition for most of the days. But every Sunday, I knew there was a feast on its way. In my great-grandmother's kitchen was the resources to all the ancestors, all the old ways, and all of the pan dulce anyone could dream about. And there we were, just like the sun and moon rise, gathered together around the table to break bread. It was what returned us to the earth, to each other, and what reminded us who we were and where we came from. You see, this is what it looked like for a lot of kids in my hood. Only what we learned in school was never a reflection of what our lives look like. You know those gardens we read about? The secret garden, the Garden of Versailles, the Garden of Eden. You know those gardens? Well, none of those, to me, contained half the magic that was planted in my grandmother's backyard. None of the books ever told stories about lands that were cultivated by brown hands and faces that looked like me and my home friends from up the street. I recall a moment in 4th grade. The subject was history, and the topic was Thanksgiving. I remember the moment and how I felt. A dash of shame and a full cup of displacement. At that time, I didn't have the words to describe how I felt, but I was ashamed that I didn't have a place in the discovery of America. Where was my role in the story told as facts of history? I remember standing up and full-on lying to my peers and teacher. I said, my family thinks that this holiday is the best, and we really like to dress up like pilgrims on Thanksgiving. She knew I was lying, but for some reason, it helped me swallow that bitter taste a little easier. I remember her looking at me with confusion and what I now know was sympathy. It wasn't in the curriculum for her to tell me otherwise, and it would have compromised her peace of mind and the food on her table. But what if that day would have been different? What if she would have held up a mirror to my face and all the other kids that looked and felt like mine and said, you have a story. You are a protagonist too. You, my beautiful First Nations children, are the reason why the Pilgrims survived. I am now 33 years old and awakening from the sleepy confusion of institutional, media-driven colonization, and I am beginning to realize that the sweet bliss spent in Ineshji's milpa was my grandmother holding on to what was left of our culture. Food was the only way for her to do that. It was like entering the kiva. All of the traditions and ceremonies safely guarded underground, just like her magic plant seeds. And in the summer, when those plants began to blossom, that's when we knew it was time to practice the old ways above ground. When I began my position at the Bishop Paiute Food Sovereignty Program, I didn't know how impactful grinding corn with a Vitamix would be to my development as a cultural educator. I didn't know that teaching my students to applaud my yeast masa between the palms of their hands would awaken their spirit and mine. I didn't know that the fiery colors of the wolffield plant, the flower that resembles the sunset, would bring me back to the daily ceremonies practiced in the milpa of my childhood. On one of the first days of garden lessons, I began to introduce myself. And quickly, one student said, hey, are you Indian? And I said, well, I actually paused, and I was searching for the answer. And the answer came out more like a question. I said, well, Indian? What do you mean? Am I from India? And there was a little bit of a giggle, and then quickly another student said, no, not from India, from here. I took a big, deep breath, and with all my power and magic, I said, no, I am not Indian. I am indigenous to this island of Turtle Island, and many of you, and just like many of you, I come from a community of people that have inhabited this earth before time began. I am Mexica, Yoremi, Darumari, Pueblo, New Mexican American woman. The answer to that question lit up the faces and the voices in the garden like you could not imagine. The pride and the hands that shot up, me too, I am Payu. At that moment, all our vision was 2020. You see, young leaders that look like the grade school me are still searching for a place to belong in academic and historical structures. They're searching for that mystical land that is built by hands and faces that look and feel like their own. When I see these young Indigenous children looking up at me and they see a face that looks and feels like them, that's when I know that the lessons I learned in my grandmother's milpa are the strongest. I stand as strong as her maíz, rooted firmly in knowing that I have become the maestra I always wished I had.